Formula One testing in Barcelona and Bahrain now done and dusted. It is the Bahrain Grand Prix this weekend. First round of the new look Formula One World Championship in 2022. Nobody better to tell us where we're at and who's going to do what than Craig Scarborough. And Craig, let's start with Mercedes, the World Constructors Champions. How did they finish Bahrain? I mean, judging by Lewis's comments, there's still a little bit of ground to be covered there.
Yeah, it's very hard to know exactly where they're at. They look like they're in trouble. And, you know, we have to look at history, and this hasn't been the first time they've ended testing, you know, woe is me, this is terrible, the car's awful. But yeah, it's clear that the car was a handful. If you think at the beginning of the Bahrain test where they unveiled the all updated W13, everyone was really excited. The rumours were it was a second a lap faster than what had gone before, which was already the car that set the fastest time at Barcelona. Something's gone wrong. I don't think it's specifically the side pods. I think whatever Merc's program was during Barcelona just didn't work out. And I do have this sneaking suspicion that Merc have kind of not engineered this, but I think this is all a part of what they were planning to try to do with this car in terms of how they were setting it up and running it through the test. I think if they really wanted to get it sorted, I'm sure they could have. I think it's just them pushing the boundaries of what's going on with the setup of these cars.
Yeah, and as you say, we've been down this road before with Mercedes, partly because they're such a good team and they get their act together. It's not a sandbagging thing. But it was interesting, I thought, on the last day to listen to the audio with Lewis in which he was basically saying, the Mercedes interviewer was trying to encourage him, say, oh, you know, big upgrade, how did it go, Lewis? And he said, well, he basically said, well, it's the same porpoising, the same bouncing that I had in Barcelona. It's just upgraded, but it's still all there and doesn't feel that great. And you say, yeah, but how was the new upgrade? Did it feel better? And he said, well, no, it didn't feel rubbish, actually. And then if you read the Mercedes press release, where there's supposedly quotes from Lewis, it's all, oh, well, you know, it's all going to be great and everything's wonderful. Thank you to all the ladies and gentlemen at the factory for making such a great job. And it's just like, you know, two different universes out there of reality, which I think is Lewis sounding pretty down in terms of how difficult, partly how difficult this specific car is to drive, upgrade or not, and partly how he feels about the new regs anyway, which I suspect was a lot of things behind the scenes there. So anyway, that's all that. And the other thing I thought I'd do, Scarbs, before we do anything else, because it's been on my mind ever since. This, what does that remind you of? Does that not remind you of a 2022?
The colours are actually surprisingly close as well, but those radiator positions are very much.
Every time I see the Mercedes, I think of Mike Pilbeam and this 1974 BRM much unloved P201. Although Jean-Pierre Beltoise did finish second in the South African Grand Prix, first time out with the car. I've got to remember that, Carlos Reutemann's first win in the Brabham. But it's that sort of radiator, funny look to the car. And of course, Mike Pilbeam's son, Kyron, I think he's still chief performance engineer or something like that at Renault, right? At Alpine,
now, yes.
Yeah. So there's a bit of a link there, kind of, somehow. But anyway, that's what that Mercedes reminds me of every time I see it. And sorry, we will get down to details, but the other thing about the Merc, visually, optically, as we love to say, is the floor now. You see so much floor, but the edging of the floor looks so unfinished and untidy now. And I guess that's just a function of the regulations as well. What's going on with all the floors there on the edge there?
Well, if you think back to this time last year when Mercedes was struggling as well by coincidence, the floor edge was simplified in the regulations. Under these regulations, there's similar rules, but still there's a lot of performance to be found with these cars with the floor edge that runs along and all the exposed bit. So what they're wanting to do is to cut sections out and put new sections and shapes and flicks and bits and pieces. And what you end up doing is a whole patchwork of different carbon fiber finishes added at different times along the floor edge.
Looks terrible.
It does look bad, but that is just the way cars are made. And with the weight limit being people struggling to get down to the minimum weight, there's no way they're going to clean that up with a bit of paint or a bit of dark lacquer or something. So we're going to end up looking with some fairly rough looking floors through the early part of the season. You'll probably find as we get towards mid-season, when they've got the flexibility and the aero worked out, they'll start to look a little bit neater, but regardless, it's still very much a
or if they get some weight out of the car in
and
other areas.
can play about, yes.
Yeah. What, I mean, do you think that they kind of overlooked the flaws then when they were drawing up these regulations and there should have been more control over what was
I
what was
mean,
going to
I
be
think
allowed
with
there?
these cars, you really should have just had pretty much just a radiused edge and that's it. But
Yeah.
what we're seeing is they've allowed to have one flap or winglet over the floor edge. They're allowed to have sections cut out of the floor edge and obviously lots of different scrolled sections and bits and pieces. And this is all aimed at directing the airflow in between, as we've always said for so many years, between the rear tyre and the diffuser. Although nowadays, because the cars run so low, you're looking very much at the area above the floor rather than underneath the floor, because these cars are absolutely dragging the ground, particularly at the back edge of that floor there.
Well, just to finish that point then, is that part of the dirty air problem, solving the dirty air problem, these floors? Is that why they've allowed them in the regulations? It's part of that package.
It's a little bit. It's just trying to manage as the air's coming out from underneath the floor, which is all important. And we had some fantastic pictures of cars up on cranes showing you those fences really creating this outwash. But that all gets picked up by the floor edge, but also by these deflectors over the front wheels and low down to the ground, straightening that flow and directing it straight at the rear tyres. So yeah, the teams work very hard with this area to try and gather back some aerodynamic performance, both with the diffuser and just with the general airflow over the car.
Yeah, the amazing shots, those of I think it was the Williams that
It was the
saw
Williams,
because
yes.
when Albon stopped with that, what was that? That fire and all, it was an oil leak of some sort of brake line, was it, or something?
I think it looked like rear brakes overheating, almost as though the brake-by-wire system just had the rear brakes on all of the time, and just everything got too hot, caught fire, and yeah, really wrecked the start of what was already a rather difficult testing period for them.
But we see all those divisions, those channels, those tunnels. How far into the car do they run? Where does the Venturi actually start underneath the chassis?
So you have this throat section, this raised bit just to the side of the cockpit, and that runs back to
So it's from the
almost
cockpit
almost sort of the back of the cockpit opening.
Wow.
And at that point, the floor it's not flat, but I'd describe it as the flat section of floor, because it's neither ramped up or ramped backwards. And these fences there, and they're creating outwash, and it's pretty much what barge boards were doing, and just the general airflow that you were having with the previous cars anyway. So what you're doing, you're diverting as much air outwards to create downforce at the front of the floor, which gives you front downforce, because obviously it's in front of the centre of gravity. And then what you're actually left with these cars is quite interesting. You've only got about 50 centimetres of inlet under the front of the car that's actually going to fill those massive diffuser tunnels at the back of the floor. And you would have thought, let's have loads of air going through. But actually, the function of this front section of floor is so important to getting the car's balance and the overall amount of downforce that they're actually kind of giving up some of the main tunnel downforce for this front area.
And why is the porpoising, the bouncing problem, reoccurring since the 1980s? What is there's obviously a lot of downforce under the back of the car there, and the centre of pressure's moving. Why is it moving? Because I say that with finishing the question, I guess. In the 80s, of course, the tunnels ran the full length of the car, didn't they? From just behind the front wheels, in effect.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. So these are sort of half that length, but still quite long. But all of a sudden, we've got this bouncing problem that we didn't have before.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, and I've spoken to lots of older engineers, shall we call them now, that were there in the day.
Yeah, and we have the Frank Durney interview there as well.
Exactly.
Saying, guys, go to the tunnel.
It's one of these things that you can't model that stalling point very precisely in a wind tunnel or in CFD, because the scaling and all sorts of bits and pieces that I don't claim to entirely understand of how they do it. So they wouldn't necessarily have picked this up. So, but the thing I've not heard at this stage is anyone actually giving us an explanation of what's going wrong underneath. Now, we know the car gets very low and something stalls and the airflow stops. But what is it? And I mean, it seems a lot of these cars at high speed, they're going a little bit tail down, which again is a kind of a classic way of setting a race car up to try and reduce drag on the straights. And it looks like the rear floor edge is touching the ground, and that could be creating some of the problems. But equally, these fences at the front, if the whole car is getting lower and they choke up, then everything downstream then falls. So I don't know exactly what's going on underneath the car. Now, lots of people all over social media are going, all you've got to do is put some bump stops on the car, or raise the ride height, or all of these.
Make it worse.
Yeah, even active suspension was proposed as a solution, which really is only it would solve it. In as much as you wouldn't get the bouncing, but the floor would still be stalling.
I can tell you now, the only thing it would solve it immediately would be skirts, sliding skirts. Sure.
Possibly.
If we went back to skirts. I'm only speaking from experience now, but I mean, that's what it was. The difference between a 1979 Lotus 79, which was the championship winning car from the previous year, and a Williams or a Ligier, which were much quicker, the effectiveness for the skirts, nothing else. And so there, the evidence is there. We don't have skirts, so it's a different solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think
we have to take now.
The whole thing's a bit more complicated.
Of course, yeah.
So you've got how much the suspension is sagging under the downforce. You've got the tyres compressing. You've got bodywork flexing. We saw lots of the teams with stays, particularly on that rear section of floor in front of the rear tyre. There's all sorts of things going on. We saw Red Bull having these problems, and it was quite interesting. Towards the end of the test, at low speed, it almost looked like they had a little bit more ride height. I wouldn't go as far to call it rake, but they did look a little bit more stood up at the back. Yeah. On the straight, they were merely flat rather than tail down. So I think it's just a case of these teams dialing these cars in, finding out how far can they go in terms of low rear ride height before they do get either porpoising or other aero problems. So I think, as I sort of said when we came into this piece talking about what Mercedes were up to.
Let's get on to Mercedes.
The fact that they're doing that doesn't mean that the car is, a complete piece of mess. It just means maybe we're going to run as low as we can, see what the effect is, and then we know we can race it back up. We were purposely running it lower than we would ever want to race it. So I think there has been some of that going on with all of the teams through testing. So that's the other side of this.
Well, we can see the quite obvious difference between the Merc from Barcelona to Bahrain and the side pods, and it's really conventional underneath. All that correct? Is what I think
this is the thing. I mean, obviously there was the whole build up to this was the whole joke about they have no side pods, and that all kind of went a little bit silly and viral because I made some jokey posts with some drawings that were never supposed to be taken seriously. But what you see there is it's not that they're zero pods, which a lot of people are calling them, or that they have no side pods. They do have side pods. They've got side pods probably with as much volume inside them as lots of the other teams. It's just a different shape. And the inlet, rather than being big and obvious, has been brought into the centre line of the car. So underneath, it's completely conventional. And actually, someone pointed out on TikTok, of all things, that if you look carefully, you can see most of the Bahrain spec W13 was already there in Barcelona. It's just the outer shape of the bodywork and some of the final detail of the ducting. And then you have the bit which most people have talked about, and certainly was the whole illegality question that cropped up, particularly with Christian Horner, it seems, about the side impact structures which the mirrors are mounted to, and how is that legal and how is that possible? Well, it's all legal, it's all possible. It's no less safe than any other car, even though they look big and spiky and exposed. Underneath that thin veneer of carbon fibre on every other car is exactly the same thing. So there's no question of legality or safety with this car. They've just changed about the shapes, and they've been quite clever with this. Now, some people have looked at these like winglets that they're formed. These people are calling them hammerheads with the mirrors on, that this is what this whole aero concept was about. I think that's more of a result of what they were trying to do. So one of the things a lot of teams have tried to do this year is work this front edge of the floor that we talk so much about.
Yep.
Now, Red Bull have got a very long undercut that suddenly comes out, so the air at the end is kind of going at a real tangent to the floor, perpendicular to the floor. And then we've seen teams more like Ferrari and particularly McLaren that have got a kind of a more bow-fronted, boat-fronted side pod. And that really is kind of straightening that flow out along the floor edge, which is much more sympathetic to what's happening around the front tyres and these front brake duct deflectors. Whereas Mercedes, what they've done is they've created this bow-fronted side pod, which, as I say, is very similar to the McLaren and the Ferrari. And this bow-fronted section, this wide black section by the floor, is actually wider than it needs to be. It's a complete void. There's nothing in there. I joke that you could actually put sandbags in there. Maybe that's what Mercedes has been doing all through testing. I'm not sure. And again, this is straightening the airflow down. And then what Mercedes then thought is, well, we've got this wide-based side pod, but we don't want big side pods, which is effectively what McLaren and Ferrari have done. So they've thought about repackaging the upper half. And that meant that they still have the conventional radiators inside, slimmed down admittedly. And they put in a vertical inlet there. Now, the vertical inlet, if you speak to any classic old race car designer, even particularly in the aero era, they say if you want to get good airflow into the radiators, then you take it just at the side of the monocoque as it flows down. Now, in the past, obviously, they used
boundary layer?
Oh, it's not messed up by the front wing and lots of other bits and pieces, so it starts to get a bit complicated. But that's the best air to take, and obviously you can either use it for cooling or you can throw it over the side pods and do other things with it. They've done something else. And then this exposed section at the top really isn't about creating downforce. They're actually trying to create the airflow and push it back down over these slope side pods. So it's interesting. I don't think it's any more valid or less valid than most of the other solutions that we've seen. I think it's amongst maybe the better ones, but I don't think it's a second a lap on its own, especially if we understand that what was physically inside the side pods hasn't changed from Barcelona through to Bahrain. It's the same radiators. We still have some electronics which are being cooled under the front of the car. You can see some inlets on the bib. Yeah. And the other big story that came out, which was rather surprising, I've heard this rumor all winter that there are some 3D printed radiators, heat exchangers, intercoolers out there. Pat Simmons actually let the cat out the bag, and I don't know why he was the one to do so. I'm sure Mercedes weren't happy. That they're using technology from a company called Reaction Rockets. Interestingly, the person that used to work there, Matt Morris, ex-McLaren Sauber designer. Yeah. He's no longer there, as I understand. And they've created a very efficient heat exchanger.
Design consultant, engineering consultant, yes. Isn't he? Yeah, really good man.
So they've developed a very efficient heat exchanger, which is used obviously in the rocket technology, 3D printed, and that can transfer into the intercooler, which if you can have the intercooler, and if we remember on the Mercedes, that is in front of the engine with a liquid jacket around it to keep it cool, and then you have a water radiator keeps that liquid cool. So
the advantage of 3D printing, quicker, easier to adjust, lighter maybe?
Yeah, you can make it much more efficient in every way. So, you know, you can make wall thicknesses smaller, you can get the flow better, because if you're manufacturing in a conventional way, you know, you've always got the constraints of, you know, thin and tube construction. Yeah. With 3D printing, that's wide open. So they appear to have gone with that technology. Now, I know there are some other ones out there, but haven't become public at this moment. So this will be something we'll talk about through the year. Other interesting point with that is not only that Mercedes, the factory team running this with their engine, they don't have to give that to all of their customers. It's the intercooler isn't normally a part of the Mercedes engine supply. Looking at the customer engines, McLaren has still got conventional intercoolers in the side pod. Looking at the Williams and the Aston Martin, I can't see a conventional bulky air-to-air intercooler in either of their side pods or over the engine on the centre line. So I wonder if they have taken supply of this innovative cooler as well, and that's helping them with their packaging, because obviously both of those are very much the outliers in terms of shrinking the air side pod package.
Well, optically, Williams seem to be the team nearest to the Mercedes in terms of doing something pretty different. So that would add up. Two things. One, the Christian Horner reaction to the pods. Interesting that he even reacted, because I mean, as if Mercedes are going to do anything on the crash test safety side. I mean, but the fact that he reacted is quite interesting. Presumably that's a response to somebody at Red Bull saying, "Oh, why have they done that?" Or we thought of that, we didn't do it, or whatever. That's presumably what happened there. And then secondly, is it too early for you to say, looking at that Mercedes upgrade, if upgrade's the right word, that is potentially more downforce for less drag? Is that still the computation that we're looking at, drag versus downforce?
So Christian's reaction, which was many people's reactions, is that can't be right, that's not legal. And there were various things thrown at this in terms of what isn't legal, where the inlet position was, the size of the shape of the inlet, the mirror wings, or the hammerhead wings, what you want to call them. And that is just a natural reaction to not really completely understanding the regulations. I looked at it and thought, I believe it's legal, but I don't understand how they justify it. And that's normally the first thing you have to do. So when someone asks Christian Horner that probably doesn't have in-depth knowledge of the technical regulations, let's face it, not many people do, even within the teams, there is that must be illegal. That doesn't look like,
because we haven't got it.
Exactly. So I don't think there was anything particularly there. And then on your
downforce versus drag, is it as simple as that?
It's the whole pattern of that has changed this year. If you remember all the way up to last year, dirty downforce, as people love to call it, get downforce no matter how much drag it costs. That was the way to go racing. With these new regulations, looking at the cars, it looks as though that has gone out of the window at the moment. Teams are looking to reduce drag as much as possible. That's why you get some of these quite interesting side pod shapes.
I remember you saying that last August, I think it was.
Yes.
That the search for reduction of drag is going to be one of the key things. Yeah,
exactly. Good. So when you come to the Mercedes thing, they're really trying to work the floor edge, which is a very efficient way of creating downforce. And equally, it's a very good way of managing the front tyre wake, which the barge boards used to do, and this big bowed section at the front of the car does as well. So
efficient in the sense of efficiency versus drag.
Yes, in terms of you're
downforce
raising a
versus
bit of
drag,
efficiency by reducing drag
Yeah.
for the same downforce. Now it may come at some point this year that people start to seek out much more downforce, but at the moment everything I've seen is inherently teams are trying to run low drag with these cars.
One of the should finish the bit here because I've been going on for a bit for Merc. But one of the interesting things is that the whole concept of this era is to make it easier to sit behind a car in dirty air and therefore to have more overtaking. But until now, in theory, the writers of the rules still don't really know what the situation is. You would imagine by the time they got to Bahrain, they would have had some sort of official FIA test to see exactly what it is like and if they have made any steps forward. But all we got, I think, was a bit of a dice between Pierre Gasly and Lewis towards the end, whether they were just had agreed to go out and just see what it was like. But it's interesting, they said it was actually did seem to be easier, and I think Yuki Tsunoda made the same comment that it did seem to be a bit easier. But if it's only a bit easier, was it worth all the trouble, I suppose, is the next thing.
Again,
nobody's saying, oh, wow, it's unbelievable now. It's like being in a Monza slipstream. And nobody's saying that, are they?
No, and I don't think we would want it to be absolutely like Formula 4.
Well, I think some people out there would.
I think there was that expectation from some people. I think it is easier, and until we actually get to free practice when the FIA can actually get two cars running and get the data from both cars, which would have to mean teammates. Obviously, in testing, you can only run one car. So unless perhaps an AlphaTauri and a Red Bull ran together, they could get the data. But I'm sure that data has been gathered and certainly will be gathered over the first races given to the FIA from the teams and say, we did this, these are the changes in pressures, therefore downforce, at these ranges. Make of it what you will. I don't know what the answer is. I hope that it's working, and certainly, anecdotally, it looks like it's an improvement, and that's good enough for me.
On a separate video, we're going to look at Ferrari, Red Bull, McLaren, and others as well. But I got to finish this one by saying to Scarbs, putting him on the spot, will a Merc be on the front row for the Bahrain Grand Prix this weekend?
Probably, yes. Yeah, I don't think these problems are deep-rooted and we'll suddenly see Mercedes thrown into the midfield, thrown into the pack. They may have a couple of difficult first races, and I see no reason why, particularly in qualifying, Lewis or George could throw out, a lap to get the front row. I think that's probably less likely. And certainly their race performance wouldn't balance that up, although they've been very reliable. So a good result in the race may simply be the fact that they finished the race, whereas lots of people may not. But I think these problems are short term, as we've seen so many times, last year being a classic example. Mercedes will work on the problem, and we'll have a competitive pack of maybe 4 cars.
Not saying anything dramatic here at all, because we know how quick George Russell is, but I thought one of the interesting things from that test, seeing George and Lewis in the same car, in one of the best bits of road of Formula One, in my opinion, which is turns 9 and 10, and how you approach 10 and go through that very quick left-hander. Lewis, again, sublime through there. You going through the left-hander wide of the center line of the road, right on the edge of the marbles. Still, actually, they look to be braking slightly earlier into there than they did in the previous year. I must talk to you about that later on. And then the big question was, how was George going to look through there? He looked pretty good, using just about the same bit of road. Slightly more edgy than Lewis, I thought, with his inputs, but looked really quick. So yeah, great driver combination in terms of outright speed. How it'll work out in terms of the championship, something else. But anyway, thanks very much indeed for that one, Scarbs.